found it, half swallowed by a century of red clay and creeping ivy. The wooden chest itself had swollen with humidity, its hinges fused to the boards like bone to marrow. When it finally gave way under the pry of the sheriff's crowbar, a smell rose, not the must of time or dust, but something damp, something human. Inside, beneath folded linens that disintegrated at a breath, was a child's bonnet, yellowed lace, delicate as cobwebs, and stained. The woman who unearthed it, a restoration worker with the state archives, said the sight of it made her knees give out. "It wasn't the bonnet," she told the reporter later, her voice trembling through the recorder's hiss. "It was the note pinned to it. It said, 'Forgive me, for he carries both our names.'" That discovery, an infant's bonnet, a cryptic confession, and an old plantation house in the heart of Georgia, reopened a story the town had buried for over a century. It was a story whispered in pews and taverns, written in family Bibles and burnt letters. The story of Eleanor Whitfield, the barren wife of a plantation owner, and Mary Grace, a young enslaved woman who carried a child not her own and not entirely her master's either. Over 12 years, that secret would twist through the walls of the Whitfield estate like black mold unseen, suffocating and unstoppable, and when it finally came to light, it would leave behind more than ruin. It would leave behind a question that still lingers among the whispering cypress of Chatham County. Who, truly, was the mother of the Whitfield heir? Because in 1854, motherhood was not merely a blessing. It was property, and property had a price. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Whitfield and the secret child that haunted Magnolia Run, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1854, and the South was still fevered with its wealth, a wealth built on cotton and on the backs of those who picked it. The Whitfield Plantation, known across Georgia as Magnolia Run, stretched for nearly 1,200 acres along the Ogeechee River, its soil rich and dark, its trees thick with moss that hung like mourning veils from their boughs. The plantation house itself was built in the Greek Revival style, white pillars, black shutters, the kind of symmetry that promised order amid cruelty. Its master, Thomas Whitfield, was a man who wore his piety like armor and his authority like a second skin. His wife, Eleanor, was the perfect image of grace, pale, slight, always dressed in mourning hues, though no loved one of hers had died, at least not in the flesh. The country around them was a place of noise and silence, of hymns and whip cracks. Savannah, only 2 days' ride away, was swelling with commerce and contradiction. Steamboats hissed on the river while auctioneers called out human names from courthouse steps. Church bells mingled with cries, and in the humid nights, even the insects seemed to hum with the tension of a country nearing its breaking point. In the fields, enslaved workers bent low over rows of cotton, their songs a rhythm older than the soil itself. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and the sweet rot of magnolia blossoms left too long in the sun. At dawn, the overseer's horn cut through the morning like a blade. At dusk, the cicadas answered him with a dirge. Inside Magnolia Run, time moved differently. Candles burned low in glass sconces. The ticking of the parlor clock marked not the hours, but the years of childlessness that haunted the mistress of the house. For in the eyes of Georgia society, a woman without a child was a body without purpose. Eleanor had been married to Thomas for nearly 10 years, and in that decade, she had buried 3 hopes of motherhood, each one lost before it ever drew breath. The doctor from Savannah, a sharp-faced man named Dr. Alcott, had whispered that her constitution was too delicate for carrying life. Thomas, humiliated, had turned his prayers into reprimands. He quoted scripture to her over supper, words about barren wombs and divine punishments. But behind the heavy drapes of her bedroom, Eleanor prayed in whispers not to God, but to something older. Those who knew her in her youth described a woman with eyes that seemed to be listening to something you could not hear. She collected herbs on that in the garden by moonlight, not for cooking but for quiet rituals, steeping leaves in bowls of rainwater, tracing circles on the table with ash. The house servants spoke of it among themselves, in low tones. Miss Eleanor talks to shadows when she thinks we ain't near. Still, she kept her composure before guests. She smiled at luncheons, played the pianoforte at Christmas, and signed her name to every church donation list. But inside her was a hunger that no hymn could satisfy. A hunger for a child. A hunger for legacy. It was in that hunger that the horror began. The first mention of Mary Grace appears in the Plantation ledger from the winter of 1854. Her name is written neatly in Thomas's hand, beside the words, housemaid, age 17. No last name. Of course, slaves were seldom granted that dignity. But her presence in the household would mark the beginning of something no record could fully capture. By all accounts, Mary was quiet, slender, and devout. Born on the plantation, she was the daughter of Ruth, a field hand, and her late husband Joseph, who had died under a lash when Mary was barely 10. Her mother taught her to sew and to pray, though both acts were done in secret ways, one to mend clothes, the other to mend spirit. Time. When Eleanor first saw her, it was said she remarked, "She has a calm about her, like the silence before a storm." Mary became Eleanor's personal maid, tending to her hair, her gowns, her letters. The two women moved through the house in silence, one bound by duty, the other by desperation. In the evenings, when the candles guttered and the crickets screamed through the open shutters, Eleanor would speak to her in fragments, questions without answers. "Do you think," she once asked, "that a soul can be born from two mothers?" Mary had not known how to answer. She only bowed her head and whispered, "I reckon the Lord can do what he pleases." "Perhaps," Eleanor murmured, staring into the mirror. "But the Lord is not the only one who listens." By the following spring, the neighbors had begun to whisper, not about Eleanor's barrenness, but about her husband's wandering eye. Thomas Whitfield was often seen riding the boundaries of his property long after dusk, his lantern a flickering ghost between the trees. It was said he took a liking to one of the young women working in the house, a girl with skin like coffee and a voice that carried sorrow in every note. When a child was born to that girl months later, the overseer recorded it in the Plantation book. Infant male, born June 5, 1855. Mother, Mary. Father, unknown. But some secrets are written not in ink, but in blood. The child was named Samuel, and though the slaves called him Little Sam, in the main house he was known only as the boy. He was light-skinned, light enough that guests might mistake him for a poor neighbor's child visiting the servants' quarters. Eleanor would visit Mary's cabin at night, carrying linens and milk, her face hidden beneath a shawl. She told the others she pitied the girl, but the truth as it would come to light years later was far more complex. For in her grief, Eleanor had done what no lady of her station would dare confess. She had asked Mary to carry a child for her, not through medicine or miracle, but through the will of her husband and the silent coercion of power. Mary had no choice, and when the baby came, Eleanor held him first. To the world, the boy was nothing. To Eleanor, he was everything. But secrets like that do not stay buried, not in a house that creaks with history, not in a land where every root hides a bone. By the time Samuel turned 12, the Whitfield name would be drenched in scandal, and the house at Magnolia Run would stand empty save for the faint laughter of a child that no one could find. The story of Magnolia Run cannot be told through one voice alone. Its truth breathes in fragments in the brittle diary pages, in the faded census names, in the letters that smell faintly of lavender and rot. To understand what happened, we must first meet those who built the tragedy and those who were consumed by it. Eleanor Whitfield. Those who saw her said Eleanor had the complexion of a porcelain doll, not the rosy kind, but the ones that seem never meant to be touched. Her skin was near translucent, her eyes a pale blue that caught the light and held it like a secret. Her hair, dark as mahogany, was always braided in coils at the nape of her neck, a style that gave her an air of dignity and control. But behind that composure was a woman constantly unraveling. She was born Eleanor Grace Templeton in 1825, daughter of a Savannah merchant whose fortune rose on the cotton trade. Her mother died of yellow fever when Eleanor was 12, leaving her to the care of nannies and tutors. She grew up surrounded by finery, imported perfumes, French novels, and whispers of marriage prospects. When she met Thomas Whitfield at a church social in 1843, she was 18 and naive. He was 10 years older, with land, manners, and a reputation for righteousness that impressed her father. The match was made within weeks. Their wedding was grand, magnolia garlands on every pew, a choir singing through candle smoke, and the scent of brandy heavy in the air. But if Eleanor had imagined herself stepping into a life of romantic bliss, Magnolia Run soon stripped that illusion away. The house was vast, echoing, and cold. The mirrors were too large, the windows too tall. She once confessed to her cousin Margaret in a letter, "Sometimes I think the house is looking back at me. It sees what I do not wish to admit." Her first miscarriage came in the second year of marriage. The doctor called it a common failure of nature. The second was more brutal, a stillborn daughter she named it in secret, Clara. Thomas refused to acknowledge the child, forbidding Eleanor to speak her name aloud. After the third loss, she stopped attending church, pleading sickness each Sunday while Thomas rode to service in his polished carriage. By 1854, Eleanor had withdrawn almost entirely from society. Visitors noted that her piano went untuned, her garden overgrown. The servants said she took to wandering the halls at night, whispering to herself in a tone that sounded like prayer but with words none of them recognized. And yet, to those who met her in daylight, she was courteous, even kind. There was something magnetic about her quietness, the kind of stillness that draws you in, the way a pond reflects perfectly before a storm breaks. One of the surviving journals from the Whitfield estate, believed to have been written by a servant named Ada, includes this line: "Miss Eleanor looked at the sky like it was a mirror, said she was waiting for God to answer her reflection." Thomas Whitfield. Thomas was born into money, and like many sons of the Georgia elite, he believed himself chosen by both blood and providence. His family had owned Magnolia Run for 2 generations, profiting first from rice, then from cotton. By the time he inherited the estate in 1841, he was 27, already a man with the calm authority of those who have never been denied anything. He stood tall, broad shoulders, angular jaw, pale hair that he combed straight back with oil each morning. His voice was measured, his posture rigid. To his peers, he embodied the Southern gentleman ideal, decisive, devout, and unbending. To those beneath him, he was something else entirely. Thomas kept meticulous ledgers, columns of crop yields beside lists of property names. Every birth, every death, every whipping noted in the same neat handwriting. He led morning prayers in the slave quarters once a month, reading from a tattered Bible with his thumb pressed hard against the verses on obedience. Behind closed doors, he drank. He did not drink to celebrate, he drank to forget. The Whitfield's inability to produce an heir gnawed at his pride. In public, he blamed Eleanor's frailty. In private, he raged at her. Once, during a dinner party, she had dropped a silver spoon just a slip of the hand, and he'd snapped, voice cold as iron. "Even your grip is weak, woman. Is there anything you can hold on to?" Guests froze. Eleanor lowered her head, said nothing. Later, one of the guests, a Colonel Harrow, would write in his letter home, "It was the first time I saw madness in a gentleman's eyes, the kind that makes him pray harder, not for mercy, but for control." Thomas believed control was a kind of salvation. He controlled his land, his workers, his wife, even his own emotions. But the human soul resists being fenced. The more he tried to confine his world to order, the more disorder found him. In 1854, when Eleanor suggested bringing a young enslaved girl into the house to assist her, Thomas hesitated not from moral concern, but from suspicion. He believed women's compassion led to weakness. Still, he allowed it, seeing no threat in a girl of 17. Her name was Mary. And though Thomas barely noticed her at first, soon her quiet presence would become the most dangerous mirror of his own corruption. Mary Grace. Mary Grace was born in a wooden cabin at the far edge of Magnolia Run, near the swamp line. Her mother, Ruth, worked in the fields but kept a secret talent for midwifery, known among the enslaved community as hands that heal. Mary inherited that touch soft, deliberate, unshaking. She was small, her skin the deep brown of wet earth, her eyes steady and intelligent. She spoke little, listened much. When she was 10, she witnessed her father's death under a lash, a punishment for attempting to escape. After that, something quiet settled in her. She didn't cry loudly. She hummed. Songs without words. Eleanor first saw her carrying water near the kitchen yard one evening. Later, she told Ada, "There's something unbroken in that girl. She could carry anything." Mary was brought into the main house that winter. She slept in a small attic room above the kitchen, where the smell of smoke and grease clung to the walls. Her duties were light, dressing Eleanor, polishing silver, tending fires. But the mistress's moods grew stranger, her requests more peculiar. One night, Eleanor woke her before dawn. "Walk with me," she said. They went into the garden, dew soaking their skirts. The moon was low and red. Eleanor knelt beside a bed of lilies and whispered, "If God has closed my womb, perhaps he expects another door to open." Mary didn't understand then. She only nodded, afraid to speak. But the weeks that followed revealed the meaning of that cryptic moment. Eleanor began insisting that Mary eat well, rest often, avoid heavy chores. She told the overseer, "She's delicate. I'll take responsibility for her condition." Thomas, at first objected, then stopped asking questions. Late at night, he visited the kitchen wing under the pretext of checking accounts. Mary's mother, Ruth, saw him go more than once. She confronted him only once, whispering, "The Lord sees, even if your kind don't." For that, Ruth was sent to work in the distant rice marshes. She never returned. Mary bore her suffering silently. She carried the child for 9 months under the constant eye of her mistress, who hovered with the reverence of a pilgrim before a relic. When the baby came, Eleanor was the first to hold him. The midwife, terrified, later said Eleanor whispered over the infant's head, "You're mine in heaven, if not on earth." From that day, Mary was never the same. Her song stopped. Her gaze turned distant. She named the child Samuel in her heart, though no one ever asked her what name she wanted. Samuel, the boy. No photograph of Samuel exists, but 2 descriptions survive, one from Ada's journal, one from a letter written by Reverend Pike, the plantation's visiting preacher. Ada wrote, "The boy looked like Miss Eleanor made him from candlelight. Pale skin, dark eyes, hair curled like a shadow on his brow." Reverend Pike recorded, "I saw in the child's face a confusion of blood and spirit. The lady calls him nephew, but the servants whisper another story. Samuel grew up between 2 worlds and belonged to neither. Eleanor educated him in secret, teaching him to read by candlelight. She forbade him from playing near the slave quarters, yet never let him dine with guests. To visitors, he was introduced as the orphan son of Eleanor's cousin, taken in out of charity. When Thomas looked at the boy, his jaw tightened. He never spoke the child's name aloud. Still, the household revolved around him, every gesture of affection, every silence, every act of cruelty bent toward that single forbidden life. Samuel's laughter echoed through halls that had known only mourning. He called Eleanor Mama Ellie in private, but never in front of others. By the time he was 12, whispers had spread through Chatham County that the Whitfields had taken in a child not of their blood, nor of another's free will. And somewhere beyond the walls of Magnolia Run, Mary watched her son from a distance, the son she had birthed but was never allowed to name. One witness later recalled seeing her in the garden one afternoon, her hands clasped around a small wooden cross she had carved herself. Eleanor appeared beside her, voice calm but cold. "He will never know you that way, Mary. You must understand. The world would not forgive it." Mary's reply was quiet, trembling. "It's not the world that needs forgiving, ma'am." No one saw Mary Grace alive again after that summer. The ledger lists her as deceased, cause unknown, but her grave, if one ever existed, was never found. The following months brought a change to the house. Windows shuttered even in daylight, doors locked that had never been locked before, and Eleanor's health waning as if some invisible sickness had passed from mother to surrogate. In the old papers found within the chest beside that bonnet, one line stands out, written in Eleanor's hand. "A soul divided is a curse doubled." And perhaps that was the truth of it, for from that division, a darkness began to spread through every corner of Magnolia Run. The first sign came with the river. In late autumn of 1856, the Ogeechee swelled after weeks of relentless rain. The water rose past the cypress roots, turning the fields into mirrors of gray sky. The slaves were ordered to move livestock to higher ground, their bodies sinking knee-deep in the red mud. One morning, when the mist lay so heavy that even the house lamp seemed to drown in it, young Samuel wandered down to the riverbank. He returned pale, shivering, and silent. When Eleanor found him in the hallway, mud streaking his shoes, she asked what he'd seen. The boy wouldn't meet her eyes. He only said, "Mama Ellie, she was in the water." "Who, child?" "The one that hums." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "You mean one of the women from the quarters?" He shook his head. She had no face, only hair, long black hair. Eleanor told him it was a dream, a trick of fog and fear. Yet that night, when she went to her window, she thought she saw something move in the field, a figure gliding through the reeds, pale dress trailing behind her like mist. She drew the curtains and prayed. But prayers have no power in a house already haunted by unspoken sins. That winter, the servants began to complain of strange things, milk souring overnight, though it was kept cold, tools found in odd places, the faint sound of humming in the nursery long after the child had gone to bed. Ada, who slept near the kitchen, woke once to the sound of footsteps above her, slow, dragging steps that crossed the ceiling toward the stairs. When she went to look, candle trembling in her hand, she found nothing but the open door to Eleanor's room, swaying gently as if someone had just passed through. By morning, Thomas dismissed the stories as superstition. "You people see spirits in every shadow," he said, voice clipped. "Next you'll be telling me the cotton talks." But even he began locking his study door at night. The unease spread beyond the house. A hunter passing through the woods claimed he saw lights flickering near the family burial plot, blue flames dancing in circles. He swore he heard a woman's voice calling from the dark, "He's mine." When word reached Magnolia Run, Eleanor forbade anyone from entering the graveyard after sundown. She told herself it was nonsense, yet she found her gaze drifting to the window each night, to the soft glow between the trees, where the voices of the crickets faltered. One evening, she caught Samuel staring there too. Do you hear her? He whispered. Who? The woman that hums. She comes when I sleep, says she knows my name. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. And what name does she call you by? He hesitated, eyes wide. Not Samuel. By spring, even the preacher could not ignore it. Reverend Pike visited one Sunday to conduct private prayer with the household. As he entered the parlor, he paused, sniffing the air. Madam Whitfield, he said quietly, forgive my bluntness, but this house smells of sorrow. Eleanor smiled politely. We've had sickness. The Reverend's eyes wandered to the child sitting by the window, idly tracing shapes on the fogged glass. Does he fall ill as well? She hesitated. No, Reverend. He dreams. Later, when the Reverend tried to lay his hand upon the boy's head in blessing, Samuel flinched. It burns, he said. The old man drew back, face pale. The Lord's hand does not burn the innocent, madam. Eleanor felt the words like a blade. Then perhaps he has forgotten us. That night, she ordered every mirror in the house covered. The humming grew louder. Sometimes it came from the nursery, sometimes from the walls themselves. Ada claimed it was the wind, but there were no drafts strong enough to make that sound low, mournful, almost human. Once, she heard it rise into a lullaby she half remembered from Mary's voice long ago. When she told Eleanor, the mistress turned white. Don't speak that name, she said sharply. Not in this house. Ada swallowed hard. Beg pardon, ma'am, but the girl's grave, it ain't where we left it. The earth's turned. Eleanor's teacup slipped from her hand and shattered. Thomas, furious at the mention, rode out that very evening to inspect the plot himself. When he returned, his boots were soaked, his hands shaking. He refused to speak of what he'd seen. The next day, he ordered a new fence built around the graveyard, and the old oak at its center cut down. The laborers protested the tree was ancient, sacred to them, but he would hear no argument. No ghost rules my land, he shouted. No dead woman claims my house. When the first axe struck the trunk, the air turned cold as rain. The blade split, the worker's hands bleeding from the shock. He swore he heard a woman cry out not from the tree, but from the ground. They abandoned the work. Thomas said nothing more. As weeks passed, Eleanor began to fade. She ate little, slept less. She sat by the fire, fingers tracing the edge of Samuel's bonnet, the same one found years later in the chest, murmuring lines from scripture and fragments of lullabies. Sometimes she spoke to someone unseen. Not yet, Ada once overheard her whisper. He's not ready. He doesn't know who he is. The servants avoided her after dark. One by one, they asked to be sold or transferred to nearby plantations. Those who stayed said they saw the mistress walking the halls with a candle, pausing at doors as if listening for a heartbeat on the other side. Thomas withdrew into his study. The sound of his prayers carried through the house, harsh, desperate, almost pleading. He burned letters, tore pages from his ledger, and once, in a fit of rage, smashed the crucifix that hung over the mantel. The final entry Ada wrote before she, too, fled Magnolia Run was short. The boy stands by the river every morning now. Says she talks to him from the water. Says she's waiting. The mistress won't go near him. The master won't look. The house is sick. The house is remembering. By the summer of 1857, the Whitfields were ghosts in all but name, and Magnolia Run was already whispering its own. By the spring of 1858, Magnolia Run had become a legend whispered between parsons and planters across Chatham County. No visitor stayed past sundown. Even the peddlers began steering their wagons off the main road that passed near the Whitfield gates. The once manicured avenue, lined with live oaks and iron fences, stood unkempt, now wild vines crawling over the gate posts, the white paint flaking away like old skin. Inside, the air had grown heavy. Dust clung to everything. Windows were nailed shut. Sunlight no longer dared enter freely. The house smelled of candle wax, ink, and slow decay. Thomas Whitfield had taken to keeping a pistol on his desk and a Bible on his lap. He seldom left his study except to eat, and even then, his eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone unseen to step forward. "Thomas," Eleanor said one evening, voice trembling, "you must stop frightening the servants. They think you've lost your reason." He looked up from his paper, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. "Let them think what they will. I've seen her." Eleanor froze. "Seen whom?" "The girl. Your girl." Her face went pale. "Don't." "She was standing in the corridor outside Samuel's room," he whispered. "The same eyes, the same dress. The candle went out when I looked at her. You tell me what devilry this is." Eleanor tried to compose herself. "You're overtired. You've been reading that book too long." Thomas slammed his hand against the desk, voice rising. "Don't you dare mock scripture to my face. You brought her into this house. You filled it with your unnatural longing, and now it crawls with sin." Eleanor's composure cracked. Her voice broke like glass. "And whose sin is it, Thomas? Mine or yours?" Silence followed, sharp and suffocating. The grandfather clock ticked between them, marking the seconds like judgment. That night they slept in separate rooms for the first time. A few days later, Reverend Pike returned. He'd received an urgent letter from Eleanor, its words uneven and desperate. "Please come. My husband has seen what I feared. Bring holy water." He arrived before dusk, his horse lathered and trembling. The house greeted him like a mausoleum. No laughter, no movement, only the faint scratching of Samuel's quill somewhere upstairs. In the parlor, Eleanor stood by the hearth, thin as parchment. "Reverend," she whispered, "something has claimed this place." Pike set down his hat, scanning the room. "It's not the house that's claimed, madam. It's your soul." He motioned for Thomas to join them, but the master remained in the doorway, watching. "Tell me," Pike continued, "when did the disturbances begin?" Eleanor hesitated. "After the birth. After Mary." Thomas's jaw tightened at the name. Pike nodded slowly. "And the boy?" "He dreams," Eleanor said. "He speaks to someone I cannot see. Sometimes I wake and find him standing by the window, murmuring to the dark." The Reverend drew out a small silver crucifix. "I'll see him." Eleanor led him upstairs to the nursery. The door creaked open, revealing Samuel seated on the floor, playing with a wooden horse. He looked up with calm, unchildlike eyes. "Good evening, Reverend," he said softly. "You know who I am. Mama Ellie told me you pray for lost people." The Reverend's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's right, son. I pray for those who've wandered from God's light." Samuel tilted his head. "She says the light burns." "Who says that, boy?" "The lady in the garden." Reverend Pike's throat constricted. "What lady?" Samuel smiled faintly. "She hums to me." The Reverend stepped forward, holding the crucifix. "You mustn't listen to her, child. You're to listen only to God." Samuel's gaze shifted to the cross. His pupils widened. "That's what she said you'd say." The air grew still. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Pike felt a tremor in his hand, just a flicker, but enough for the boy to notice. Samuel's smile vanished. He looked down and whispered almost kindly, "You can't bless what was never forgiven." The Reverend left the room pale as wax. In the hallway, he whispered to Eleanor, "The child knows things no innocent should. You must leave this house." But Eleanor shook her head. "I cannot. He's mine." "Then God help you," Pike muttered. 2 weeks later, the first death occurred. It was Ada, the servant, who had seen too much, written too much. She was found in the morning lying near the garden well, her body twisted, her eyes open toward the sky. The doctor from town claimed she'd fallen, though her neck bore no marks of impact, only bruises shaped like fingers. Eleanor refused to let Thomas call the sheriff. "There's been enough scandal," she said. But word spread quickly, as it always does in small places. By the next Sunday, the congregation in town buzzed with rumors, whispers of witchcraft, madness, and the Whitfield's strange, pale boy. One woman told her neighbor she'd seen Eleanor at dawn, walking barefoot across the lawn, her nightgown soaked, carrying something that looked like a child's toy. Another swore she heard laughter not human, but thin and hollow, echoing from the fields long after midnight. Soon, even the enslaved families who remained on the estate refused to sleep near the main house. They moved their cots to the smokehouse or the stables, muttering prayers in the old tongue their ancestors brought from the coast of Africa. Thomas's health deteriorated next. His hands shook when he tried to sign documents. His appetite vanished. He began to mutter to himself, repeating verses from Job, "The thing which I greatly feared is come upon me." Eleanor avoided him. She spent her nights at Samuel's bedside, holding his hand as though the boy's pulse were the only thing keeping her tethered to life. But even she began to see things. One night, while trimming a candle wick, she caught a reflection in the brass mirror above the mantel, a woman's silhouette behind her. She turned, heart hammering. No one stood there, but on the glass, a handprint lingered, small, damp, unmistakably real. Later, she told Reverend Pike in a letter, "She will not let me go. I thought she only wanted him, but she wants us all." The Reverend returned again in midsummer. He came armed this time, not with pistol or blade, but with scripture and salt. He brought a sack of chalk, a flask of holy water, and a single silver ring that had belonged to his late wife. When he arrived, Eleanor was waiting in the hall, candle in hand. "You're too late," she said. He frowned. "Where is the boy?" "Asleep. But she's near." Pike followed her gaze to the parlor. The curtains swayed, though no wind moved. The fire flickered blue. He uncorked the flask and began sprinkling water along the doorframe, muttering Latin under his breath. The moment the drops hit the threshold, the flame in the hearth sputtered violently, then extinguished. The house fell into darkness. Eleanor gasped. From upstairs came a sound, the faint rhythm of humming, slow and familiar. Pike raised his hand. "Stay here." But Eleanor followed, clutching her candle. Together they climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath their weight. The humming grew louder, echoing down the corridor. It led them to Samuel's room. The door was ajar. The boy stood by the window, his eyes unfocused, his lips moving silently. "Samuel," Eleanor whispered. He didn't turn. Pike stepped forward. "In the name of the Father." Before he could finish, Samuel spoke. "She's here." The candle went out. Something cold brushed past them, a draft, or a breath. The floorboards creaked behind Eleanor, and when she turned, she saw it. A shadow darker than the dark itself, shaped like a woman, hair hanging over her face. The Reverend raised the crucifix, but the air pulsed, heavy as thunder. Eleanor screamed as the candle's last ember flared red, illuminating the child's face, half Mary's, half her own. Then the light died. When dawn came, the Reverend was gone. Thomas found his Bible in the hallway, pages wet with river water. In the following weeks, the town gossiped that Reverend Pike had fled to Savannah in a state of delirium. Others said they found him wandering the woods, muttering about a child with two souls bound by one sin. No one ever saw him preach again. Eleanor grew weaker still. She refused food, drank only rainwater, and spent hours staring at the garden. "She waits there," she told Thomas once. "Under the lilies." Thomas had ceased arguing with her. He had stopped speaking altogether. The house had become a tomb of unspoken things. One humid night in August, the neighbors saw fire flickering over Magnolia Run. They rushed toward it, fearing the plantation had caught ablaze. But when they arrived, the flames vanished, leaving behind only smoke and the sound of a child laughing somewhere in the trees. The sheriff came the next morning, summoned by a rider who'd seen the glow. He found the gate open, the horses gone, the doors unlatched. Inside, the house stood silent. In the study, a single sheet of paper lay on Thomas Whitfield's desk. On it was written in Eleanor's hand, "If blood makes kin, then sin makes family." The sheriff turned to the staircase, calling out once, twice. From upstairs came an answering voice, soft and steady. "She's not gone. She just went home." It was Samuel. And behind him, faint but unmistakable, the sound of humming rose once more. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. By the time the sheriff reached the upper floor of Magnolia Run that morning, the boy was gone. The nursery window stood open, lace curtains twisting in the wind. A child's toy horse lay on its side near the sill, one wheel cracked, one eye missing. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Outside, the yard stretched silent beneath the gray dawn. Only the magnolia trees seemed to move, their leaves whispering as if repeating a name. "Samuel?" the sheriff called. No answer. He stepped into the hallway, boots creaking on the warped boards. The portraits along the wall ancestors of the Whitfield line had all been turned to face the wall. In the master bedroom, Thomas Whitfield sat motionless on the edge of his bed. His Bible rested open on his knees, but his eyes were blank. "Mr. Whitfield?" Thomas didn't respond. The sheriff approached cautiously. "Where's your wife, sir?" Thomas blinked, slow and heavy. "She went into the garden." "When?" "Before the boy." The sheriff frowned. "And where's the Reverend?" Thomas gave a small, empty smile. "He followed her. They all follow her." It was then the sheriff noticed the stain on the man's sleeve, dark, dried, almost black. "Sir," he said carefully, "I need you to come with me." Thomas looked up, voice barely a whisper. "I told her God would not forgive, but she didn't want his forgiveness. She wanted his power." Down by the garden, the lilies had bloomed early, tall, white, and unearthly bright against the soaked earth. The air was still except for the hum of flies. Eleanor lay among them, her body cold, her face turned toward the river. Her eyes were open, lips slightly parted as though she had died mid-prayer. The sheriff knelt beside her. No blood, no mark of struggle. Only one detail stood out. Her hands were clutching something tightly against her chest. It was a bonnet, the same one that would be found again a century later, sealed in that rotting chest. Pinned to it was a note, ink blurred by water but still legible. "Forgive me, for he carries both our names." The sheriff's throat went dry. He looked toward the river. The reeds bent under an unseen wind, and somewhere beyond them, a child's laughter echoed once, then faded. He searched for the boy for 2 days. Dogs combed the woods. Boats drifted along the riverbank. They found no trace, no footprints, no clothing, nothing. By the 3rd day, they stopped looking. The newspapers told only part of the story. The Savannah Morning Chronicle, dated September 3rd, 1858, printed a short column under local disturbances in Chatham County. The tragic demise of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, wife of plantation owner Mr. Thomas Whitfield, has stirred much speculation among neighbors and clergy alike. Found deceased near the gardens of Magnolia Run, her death appears to have been of natural cause, though rumors of unwholesome influences persist. The Whitfield heir, a boy of 12 years, is missing and presumed drowned. Mr. Whitfield remains under care. Privately, the townspeople said otherwise. They said Thomas had gone mad, that he'd been found wandering the halls, calling out two names, Eleanor and Mary. They said he swore the river sang at night. They said he'd confessed to the preacher from the next county over, raving about a pact made between women, one barren and one bound. The preacher recorded the conversation in his journal, a document later recovered in the 1890s during a state liquidation. His handwriting trembles across the page. He speaks of a child conceived not in sin, but in desperation, that the wife did pray for a soul, and the servant did bear it, and between them they made something not wholly man. He says the woman's prayers were answered by another power, not divine, but ancient. He says the river knows its name. By winter, Magnolia Run was abandoned. Thomas was committed to a sanatorium outside Savannah, where he spent his final years in silence. The official record lists his cause of death as apoplexy, but one of the attendants later told a reporter that on the night he died, the old man had been found standing by the window, muttering the same phrase again and again. "She's not in the ground, she's in the water." Years passed. The plantation decayed, swallowed by vines and rumor. The new owners, a merchant family from Charleston, tried to restore it in the 1870s, but their servants refused to stay past dusk. One maid claimed she'd found damp footprints leading from the nursery to the river. Another swore she heard a child's voice whisper her name while she swept the halls. After that, the house changed hands 3 more times before being left empty for good. Locals called it the widow's estate. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in at night to see the ghost of the singing woman who appeared by the water on moonlit evenings. No one ever saw her clearly, but those who claimed to hear her said her song was not mournful. It was a lullaby. In 1901, a historian named Clara Bellamy visited Magnolia Run while researching antebellum family histories. Her notes survive in the archives at Emory University. One entry reads, "The Whitfield property is desolate but strangely preserved. The nursery upstairs remains intact toys, cradle, a small bonnet on the mantel. The air carries a scent of lilies, though the garden is overgrown. A local boy who guided me here refused to enter. He said, 'The river talks after dark.'" She stayed one night in the house. Her last diary entry before leaving. "There was music from the garden, not wind, not bird. A woman's voice humming a tune I somehow knew, though I'd never heard it before. I dreamt of water and a child calling out Mama Ellie. I awoke with my hands wet." Clara left the next morning and never returned to Georgia. By 1930, the main structure had collapsed in parts, though the foundations still stood. Local WPA workers who cleared the site reported finding fragments of bone near the well, small, delicate, possibly a child's. The remains were sent to the county coroner, who labeled them animal. The file disappeared a few years later. It was only in 1964, during preparations for a state heritage restoration, that the chest was found, the one buried beneath a loose floorboard in the study. Inside it lay the bonnet, the letter, and a few strands of dark hair tied in a ribbon. The handwriting on the note matched Eleanor's. And pinned beneath it, wrapped in a folded page torn from a Bible, were 3 words, "Both forgiven now." That discovery reignited public fascination. Reporters descended on Chatham County. Scholars debated whether the story was truth or legend. One article in Southern Folklore Quarterly suggested that Eleanor's pact with Mary Grace reflected a real practice among isolated plantation women, a superstition known as shadow mothering. where a barren mistress might compel a surrogate under the guise of prayer rituals, blending African and Christian elements in secret. But others argued that Magnolia Run's tragedy was less supernatural and more human, a tale of exploitation, grief, and guilt, twisted by years of silence. A descendant of one of the enslaved families, Hester Lowe, gave an interview in 1972 to the Savannah Tribune. "My great-grandma said that girl, Mary Grace, she didn't die right away. Said she come back to the house after the birth, begging to see her baby. Miss Eleanor slammed the door on her. That girl went to the river and never come out. The next morning, Miss Eleanor was out there, crying into the water. From then on, every night you could hear the same crying till she died too." When asked if she believed the hauntings were real, Hester smiled sadly. "Maybe not ghosts. Maybe it's just the sound of what people done echoing forever." Yet, the more the story was studied, the more inconsistencies emerged. One historian claimed to have found a record of a Mary Grace Whitfield listed in the 1870 Freedmen's Bureau census alive, living near Macon, with a 12-year-old boy named Samuel. The handwriting was faded, the ink uncertain. The record vanished from the archive within months. Was it coincidence? Or had the secret child survived hidden, renamed, and carried forward by the woman who once birthed him in bondage? If that were true, then whose bones lay near the well? Whose body the sheriff found among the lilies? A researcher in 1989, Dr. Lenore Haskins, tried to reconcile the contradictions in a documentary titled The Two Mothers of Magnolia Run. She proposed that both Eleanor and Mary were buried on the same night, one by her own hand, the other by the rivers, and that the boy, half white and half enslaved, had been smuggled away north by freedmen sympathetic to Mary's plight. But even Dr. Haskins, an academic skeptic, confessed something unsettling on tape during production. "We filmed at the site. Our audio picked up low-frequency vibrations no one could explain, like a woman's hum beneath the wind. It stopped whenever someone said the name Samuel." The documentary aired once, late at night, on local PBS. It was never rebroadcast. No, and yet the legend persists. Every few years, a traveler claims to hear music by the river. Some say the lilies bloom unnaturally white at Magnolia Run, fed by something beneath the soil. Others swear that on mist-heavy mornings, a figure can be seen walking from the ruins to the water, a woman in black, holding a child's bonnet. The Whitfield line ended with Thomas. His estate passed to creditors, his name to the shadows. But the child was never found. And so the question remains, hanging over the ruins like the scent of damp earth. Was Samuel the cursed fruit of cruelty and guilt, or something else entirely, something born of desperate prayer and stolen life? Because in the South, where faith and sin grow from the same soil, sometimes the line between miracle and monster is no thicker than a mother's whisper. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer below. Your theories breathe life into these forgotten stories. The truth, if such a thing can be said to exist after so many years, came not from historians, nor from the whispers of descendants, but from a single object unearthed by floodwater. In the summer of 1998, after weeks of rain, the Ogeechee River swelled once more and broke its banks near the ruins of Magnolia Run. Volunteers from the county's historical society went out to assess the erosion damage. Among the reeds and mud, one of them found a stone slab, half buried, half tilted toward the current. It bore no surname, only a faint inscription carved by hand. MG 1855, 1858. The river remembers. Beneath the stone lay fragments of wood, the remains of a small box, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a brittle sheaf of paper. The writing was shaky, uneven, but legible enough to change everything that had been believed about Magnolia Run. It was Eleanor Whitfield's confession. The document, later authenticated by handwriting analysis, began with a salutation. To whoever finds this, know that I write not to seek absolution, but to tell what truth I may before my soul departs this earth. The Lord has turned his face from me, and rightly so, for I have done what no woman should ever do. Her words continued in the formal cadence of the mid-19th century, yet behind them was the unmistakable tremor of madness or revelation, perhaps both. For years I prayed for a child. I begged and bled for one, offered my body to medicine, to penance, even to superstition. When the doctor told me that my womb was a grave, I felt the world tilt away from me. What purpose has a woman without seed? It was then that the thought came not from heaven, but from somewhere lower, older. I remembered the prayers my nurse used to whisper when I was a girl, words her mother brought from the islands. She said there are spirits in the water that hear what God will not. I was desperate enough to listen. Eleanor described a ritual the night of a storm, the air thick with rain, the scent of lilies crushed in her hands. I went to the river. I brought milk, honey, and a lock of my own hair. I spoke her name 3 times, though I did not know who she was, only that she was listening. I asked for a child of my blood and my breath, if not my body. The water rippled though no wind stirred it. A voice came soft, like a woman's hum, and it said, "Then share your womb with hers." That line was underlined twice. Eleanor continued. Days later, I saw her, the girl, Mary Grace. She had the same eyes I had seen in the river's reflection. I knew it was her. Not chance, not coincidence, but providence of another kind. I told Thomas that she would serve me in the house. He agreed, thinking it charity. But in truth, it was covenant. She wrote of her bargain with Mary, a conversation held in whispers and shadows. I told her I could make her free, that she would never toil in the fields again. All I asked was that she bear a child not for him, but for me. I said the Lord would bless her for it. I lied. I had already made my vow to the river. When she conceived, I prayed each night to that same water, thanking it for what the heavens had denied me. I felt the child's life as if it were within me. I dreamed his heartbeat, saw his face in my sleep. When he came into the world, I took him in my arms and said, "You are mine." But in that moment, I felt the water inside me turn cold. I had stolen something sacred, and the river remembered. Then came the most chilling passage of all. Mary began to fade. She said she heard the same voice at night calling her to the river. She begged to see the child. But I refused. I feared what might happen if she touched him. The last night she came to the door, her eyes black with grief, her dress soaked from the rain. She said, "He cries for me in his dreams." I told her he was mine by blood, by promise, by God. She said, "Then God will take him." When I awoke the next morning, she was gone. Only footprints led down to the water's edge, and in the shallows lay her shawl. I buried what I found there, but the earth never stayed still. Sometimes it seemed to breathe. That was when the boy began to hum. Eleanor described Samuel's strange habits, his refusal to pray, his fascination with mirrors, his tendency to stand at the river for hours murmuring to himself. He told me once, "She says you borrowed me, Mama Ellie." I asked who he meant. He said, "The lady with the wet hair." After that, I covered every mirror, for I feared she was looking through him at me. Thomas began to see her too. The smell of the lilies followed us everywhere. I burned them in the garden, but they grew back overnight. I knew then that our sin had no grave. It had roots. The Reverend came. He said to cast out the devil, but I told him there was no devil, only debt. He prayed over Samuel and fainted. When he woke, he wept. He said he heard a mother's lullaby from inside the boy's chest. I told him it was not madness, it was balance. The final paragraphs of the confession trailed into near delirium. The ink blotted. The handwriting slanted as though written in haste or fear. I have come to understand what the river meant. The child is neither mine nor hers. He is both. Flesh of one, spirit of the other. That is why he cannot be still. He belongs to two mothers and no world. I hear him call her name at night, and I hear her answer through him. If she comes for him again, I will not fight. I only ask that she forgive me for loving him too much to let him go. If blood makes kin, then sin makes family. The papers ended there, but beneath them, in the oilcloth wrapping, archaeologists found something else: a child's tooth, small and milk white, and a silver cross etched with two sets of initials, EW and MG. When the document was first shown to scholars, most dismissed it as a forgery too convenient, too melodramatic. Yet the ink analysis confirmed it dated to the 1850s, and the soil residue matched that of the Ogeechee floodplain. Forensic linguists compared the writing to Eleanor's surviving letters. Every flourish matched. It was real. And with it, the story of Magnolia Run shifted from rumor to revelation. Local historian Evelyn Harper, who led the excavation, later described her experience in an interview for the Southern Review. When I held those pages, the air felt heavier. It wasn't just guilt in her words, it was awe. She truly believed she had invoked something, and part of me wonders if she did. That river floods more than any in the county. It keeps giving back what people tried to bury. Indeed, the Ogeechee remains one of Georgia's most unpredictable waterways. Locals still say its currents carry memory. After the 1998 flood, the same volunteer who found Eleanor's confession claimed that, as he waded to shore, he felt something brush against his legs, small, like a child's hand. He refused to return. There was one final revelation, however, unearthed not by archaeologists, but by DNA. In 2001, a genetic study traced descendants of both the Whitfield and Grace lines, two branches long believed separate. One sample, submitted anonymously from Savannah, showed a 99.4% match to both. The test subject, a middle-aged woman named Ruth Ann Greer, claimed to be the great-great-granddaughter of Mary Grace through her son, Samuel Grace. She had never heard of the Whitfields, Eshan. When told of the connection, she wept and said something that would later close her segment of the documentary, Blood and Water. Maybe that's why our family never left this county. Maybe we belong to both worlds, the ones who prayed and the ones who paid. For many, the confession confirmed the horror was real, not supernatural, but moral. A crime cloaked in sanctity. A woman so consumed by her longing for motherhood that she traded another's soul for it. But for others, the locals, the descendants, the believers, the river still hums at night, and they say the story isn't finished. Evelyn Harper returned to Magnolia Run in 2003 for a televised interview. The site was overgrown again, the foundations lost beneath vines. As cameras rolled, she stood where the nursery once was and spoke into the dusk. Halfway through, her microphone caught a faint background noise, a single sustained note, rising and falling like a human hum. She stopped speaking. "Did you hear that?" The cameraman nodded. "Probably the wind." But when they played back the recording later, the hum resolved into a few distinct notes, a lullaby. The same melody that had been recorded in Clara Bellamy's 1901 diary. Not wind, not bird. The same tune whispered through 3 generations of folklore. The song of a mother who never stopped calling her child home. And so, the final image of Magnolia Run is not of fire or flood, but of still water, the reflection of cypress trees trembling under the weight of centuries. Somewhere beneath that surface, perhaps, lies the answer to whether sin can love as fiercely as faith. Or perhaps it is better left unsolved. Because sometimes the deepest horrors are not in what the dead did to the living, but what the living asked the dead to do for them. If you stood in that room, with that confession in your hands, would you have burned it or read it aloud? Tell us in the comments. The 2001 DNA revelation should have been the end of the story, the neat conclusion historians crave, a name to pin on a century-old ghost. But history does not rest as easily as the dead, especially not when the dead have been speaking all along. In the autumn of that same year, the Georgia Historical Preservation Society authorized a limited excavation of the Magnolia Run garden, the same site where Eleanor's body had reportedly been found among the lilies. The goal was simple: confirm burial patterns, catalog artifacts, and once and for all determine whether the grave of Mary Grace actually existed. They found 2 coffins, both small, both unmarked. The wood had decayed almost to dust, but the soil inside each was distinctly different. One grave contained traces of lily pollen and a fragment of silk fine material, the kind used in ladies' mourning dresses. The other contained remnants of rough linen and a string of wooden prayer beads. Side by side, barely a hand's width apart. One team member, Dr. Paul Remington, noted in his field journal, "It appears deliberate, not master and servant, not mistress and maid, but equals, a pairing. The bones are minimal, perhaps partial burials or symbolic reinterments. The ground above seems to have been disturbed multiple times over the years, as if someone kept digging them up and putting them back." When word spread, locals began leaving flowers and ribbons at the site. Within weeks, the garden was filled again lilies, always lilies. Evelyn Harper returned to oversee the closing of the dig. The night before the soil was sealed again, she walked alone through the ruins. Later, she would write in her personal diary, "The air was thick with that smell again, sweet decaying lilies. I stood between the 2 graves and felt something like wind, but moving upward, through the ground. My hands went cold, and I thought I heard a woman say, 'He's safe.'" She told no one until years later. After the excavation, a final item from Eleanor's chest previously overlooked was re-examined. It was a small scrap of cloth embroidered with initials, S.W. Samuel Whitfield. At first, researchers assumed it meant Eleanor had claimed the boy as her legal son, perhaps even forged documentation before her death. But deeper inspection revealed something else. The reverse side of the cloth, faded and nearly illegible, bore another set of initials, S.G. The same thread, 2 names sewn one over the other. Like 2 identities trying to occupy the same space. Dr. Remington wrote in his report, "This object is emblematic of the entire case, a duality stitched into existence. The boy belonged to both worlds, claimed by both women, erased by both histories." The final hours of Magnolia Run, however, remained unconfirmed until an unexpected discovery in 2015, when a private collector from Savannah donated a box of old wax phonograph cylinders to the university archives. Among them was one labeled, in spidery script, "Whispering River, 1903. It had been recorded by an unknown amateur using one of the first portable phonographs. When digitized, the recording revealed the faint sound of running water, birds, and after a few seconds, a human voice singing. A lullaby. The words were indistinct, half swallowed by static, but the tune matched a fragment preserved in Reverend Pike's church ledger, the hymn Mary Grace was said to have sung while working in the fields. "Sleep, my child, the night is long. River, hum your mother's song." The chilling part came near the end of the recording. Over the woman's voice, a man speaks softly, as if taking field notes. His accent is refined, educated, possibly English. "The legend says she walks the banks, calling for her son. The people here swear the water sings back. Nonsense, of course. Yet, I admit, the sound is peculiar." He pauses. "Wait, listen." There is a long silence. Then, faintly, another voice joins the first. Higher, childlike. Mama Ellie. The cylinder ends with the sound of rushing water, as if the machine itself were swallowed by the river. Forensic analysis later determined that the background water noise was not from the Ogeechee, but from a smaller tributary near the Magnolia Run estate, the same stretch where the graves had been found. To this day, no one knows who made the recording. The donor claimed it came from a British explorer's estate sale, the name lost to history. By now, Magnolia Run had transformed from a historical curiosity into an American Gothic myth. Documentaries, novels, even operas drew from its dual tragedy. The barren wife and the enslaved surrogate, their child caught between salvation and damnation. But among the people who live along the Ogeechee, the story is not entertainment. It is caution. Elderly locals still refuse to draw water from the river after dark. Fishermen claim that every so often they find lilies tangled in their nets white as bone, though no lilies grow upstream. And every year, on June 5th, the child's recorded birth date, people gather at the site to leave offerings: candles, bonnets, crosses, toys. In 2017, a television crew from Atlanta attended the vigil for a segment on local folklore. During a live broadcast, as cameras panned across the crowd, the microphone picked up a strange, low hum. The sound engineer later isolated the frequency. It was below human vocal range, resonating at 19 hertz, the same frequency known to cause feelings of dread and unease. It was continuous, unwavering, almost rhythmic, like a lullaby slowed to a heartbeat. The broadcast cut to commercial. The station refused to air the footage again. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence, though, appeared in 2020, when the remains of Reverend Pike were exhumed during renovations to the old church cemetery. In his coffin, beside the Bible clutched to his chest, lay a small object, a child's toy horse, one wheel cracked, one eye missing. How it came to be buried with him remains unexplained. The last known document tied to the Whitfields appeared 2 years later in an antique shop in Charleston. It was a letter addressed to "My dearest Samuel," written in the same elegant hand as Eleanor's confession. It read, "If you live, then I am glad. If you remember, then forgive. I thought I could make you whole, but I only split you in two. Wherever you are, know that your mothers loved you each in their own broken way." The letter was never mailed. The shopkeeper who sold it said it came from a box labeled River House 1890. So what, then, is the truth of Magnolia Run? Perhaps it is this: two women, bound by power and loss, created something neither heaven nor earth could name, a child born of love and coercion, of faith and transgression, carrying the burden of both. Eleanor believed she could steal life from death. Mary believed she could reclaim it through love. And the river that eternal witness took them both. But there is another way to see it, whispered among the locals who still live near the old ruins. They say that sometimes, on fog-heavy mornings, you can see three shapes by the water: a woman in white, a woman in black, and a boy between them, holding both their hands. The three walk slowly toward the current until the mist swallows them. Then the lilies bloom. Historians argue over details, theologians debate the sin, but perhaps the real horror of Magnolia Run lies not in ghosts or curses, but in the questions it leaves behind: questions about power, motherhood, and the fragile thread that binds one soul to another. Was Eleanor damned for her blasphemy, or pitied for her grief? Was Mary a victim, or a mother who took back what was hers? Was the child an abomination, or a miracle too great for the world to hold? When the Savannah Historical Museum hosted its Blood and Water exhibition in 2023, visitors were met with a simple installation: a shallow basin of clear water, a projection of ripples across the ceiling, and a recording of a woman's voice humming softly. Next to it hung Eleanor's final words, etched into glass. A soul divided is a curse doubled. But below it, someone, perhaps a visitor, perhaps a curator, had scrawled another line in pencil. Or maybe it's love multiplied. No one has ever taken credit. So perhaps that is what remains, not ghosts, but echoes. Not judgment, but yearning. The kind of yearning that drives a woman to defy heaven, a man to damn himself in silence, and a child to haunt the world that would not name him. In the end, the horror of Magnolia Run is not what was done, but what was wanted. The unholy hunger to fill an emptiness that no God, no law, no morality could satisfy. That hunger still lingers. It hums beneath the water. It breathes through the lilies. It waits in the silence between prayers. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right across the Ogeechee, you can still hear the river whisper back, "He carries both our names." If you stood in that garden, with the lilies blooming over two graves, would you call it crime, redemption, or something older than either? Tell us what you believe in the comments below. For more than a century after Eleanor Whitfield's death, the South never spoke of Magnolia Run, except in passing a half-remembered cautionary tale, murmured over porches and pews. But as time carried the memory from witness to myth, its story became less about a haunted house and more about the soul of a nation. Because the truth of Magnolia Run was never confined to one plantation, one family, or one river. It was the story of an entire society built upon division of bodies, of blood, of motherhood itself. When scholars revisited the case in the late 20th century, they began to see Magnolia Run not as an isolated tragedy, but as a mirror of American hypocrisy. The Whitfield house, with its white columns and polished silver, had been an altar to appearances, a place where holiness and horror slept in the same bed. Eleanor's desperation for a child reflected the impossible ideals placed upon women of her class to bear heirs, to preserve lineage, to embody virtue even when their bodies failed them. Mary Grace's suffering reflected the dehumanization of those whose wombs were treated as property, whose motherhood was both used and denied. And Samuel, the boy with two names, became the ghost of the country itself, half slave, half free, half loved, half erased, the embodiment of a truth America would spend the next century trying to bury and unearth again and again. In 2004, when the Blood and Water exhibition toured nationally, it ignited fierce debate. Church groups protested what they called the romanticizing of sin. Descendants of the Whitfields issued statements urging the museum to remove Eleanor's confession, calling it a forgery meant to tarnish our family's name. Yet descendants of the enslaved Grace line came to see the story as a reclamation proof that even in the darkest cruelty, a mother's voice had survived, hidden beneath a name that was not her own. During one forum in Savannah, a woman named Ruth Ann Greer, the same descendant whose DNA had linked the two bloodlines, spoke to a crowded auditorium. Her words silenced the room. "My grandmother used to say every river's got memory. Maybe that's why we tell these stories, to remind the water who it carried. People ask if I believe in ghosts. I don't. But I believe in what guilt leaves behind. That's what haunts us." Applause followed, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Universities began adding the Whitfield Confession to history syllabi alongside 12 Years a Slave and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Scholars debated its authenticity, theologians its meaning. Was it truly a pact with darkness, or a desperate act of a woman who had already been condemned by her own society's silence? Some historians argued that Eleanor's ritual at the river was symbolic, her so-called bargain, a metaphor for coercion, her way of confessing to what she could never name outright: the rape, the exploitation, the theft of another woman's body. Others believed her words literally, that she had called something ancient from the Ogeechee, a spirit of vengeance and balance that punished both the enslaver and the enslaved alike. Both interpretations, in their own ways, tell the same truth: the price of power is blood, and the South has never stopped paying it. When the remains from the Magnolia Run garden were finally reinterred in 2006, the service was small but solemn. Descendants of both families stood side by side under the cypress trees. A pastor from Savannah read from the Book of Psalms, his voice carrying softly over the river. Then, in a gesture unplanned but deeply symbolic, Ruth Ann Greer stepped forward and placed two objects on the new shared marker: a white bonnet and a strand of river lilies. She said nothing. The wind moved through the grass, and for a moment, the river itself seemed to hush. Afterward, a local paper described the scene simply: for the first time in 150 years, Magnolia Run was quiet. Today, the site remains preserved as a state landmark, though few visit after sundown. The foundations of the old house are marked by low brick outlines. Wildflowers grow where the parlor once stood. Information plaques tell a story that reads, part history, part elegy. But even now, caretakers report strange occurrences: footsteps where no one walks, the faint sound of humming near the water's edge. No one records it anymore. They've learned to let the past hum to itself. And perhaps that is how such stories should end, not with resolution, but with remembrance. Because the horror of Magnolia Run is not in its ghosts, but in its truth. A truth about how the living tried to own creation itself, and how creation through love, vengeance, or miracle refused to be owned. The lilies still bloom every spring. The river still swells and recedes, like a heartbeat. And somewhere in its reflection you might still glimpse two women, one pale, one dark, walking the banks together, their faces calm at last, the boy between them smiling. Whether they are real or imagined no longer matters. The land remembers them. The water keeps their story. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video, and subscribe for next week's story.